So we begin with the question, with the custom that we read people, many Jewish communities have the custom that they read the Book of Ruth in the synagogue on Shavuot. Happens to be, it's not a Chabad custom, so we don't do it. So if you come to Chabad, you get your cheesecake a little earlier. So we don't formally read the Book of Ruth. During the all-night study learning, the Kabbalistic order, it's called the Tikkun, is you say different parts of the written Torah, different parts of the oral Torah, and part of the Zohar. So there we say the whole Book of Ruth. But there is a custom, long-standing custom. It's not in the Talmud, that's why we don't say it, but it's probably 1,000 years old, maybe a little bit more or less. Now, what's the connection between this Book of Ruth and the holiday of Shavuot? So there are multiple connections. We'll start with at least 3. Number 1, the tradition is that Shavuot is, the Talmud says, Shavuot is the day of the birthday and passing of King David. Now, what is the Book of Ruth? Book of Ruth, essentially what it's doing is it's giving you the lineage of King David. So the end of the Book of Ruth, it talks about how Ruth was King David's great-grandmother, or great-great, a few greats, gives you the lineage from Ruth and Boaz to King David. So that's why the Megillah, the entire scroll of Ruth, is related to King David. Shavuot is related to King David, so we read the Book of Ruth. That's one reason. Another reason offered is because the drama, or the mini-drama, the Book of Ruth takes place in the field, and it describes the mitzvot of the harvest, which is to leave the stalks of grain to the poor. So if you harvest the field, and while you're harvesting, there's going to be 1 or 2 stalks that fall to the ground every time you cut the bundle with your sickle. So those stalks you have to leave for the poor. So that's the scene where important parts of the story take place. And therefore, we read it during the time of Shavuot, because Shavuot is the season of the harvest. So in some sense, what we want to do is we want to remind people of the commandments of the harvest, and therefore we read the story. So that's reason number 2. And the third reason, sort of those first 2 are sort of peripheral. King David's yahrzeit was Shavuot, okay? We really want to hear about the mitzvot of the harvest, so we bring in the plot. The third reason is probably the most directly connected. Ruth is a sincere convert, and she represents the idea of accepting the Torah. And in some sense, on Shavuot, what are we celebrating? We're celebrating when all the Jewish people convert. In other words, accept God and accept Judaism. So in some sense, this is the story of a conversion, of a sincere conversion. And that is related to the day because that's really essentially accepting the Torah for everybody. So we all converted, and Ruth is the example of a sincere convert. Many of the laws of conversion in the Talmud are derived from verses in the Book of Ruth. So that's a little bit of background of why we read it. I think we should summarize the book. I'm just debating if we should read a summary inside, and then we can talk about overarching themes, and then we can talk about reading some of those verses inside and seeing what the emphasis is. So we begin. Okay, so I wish they had something a little shorter, but I guess it's not terribly long. I don't know if it's too long. Okay, let's see. We'll put the timer. We'll see if we can get this in under 5 minutes. So this is sort of the summary of the story. Ruth was a Moabite princess, a very fine character, who became the great... Okay, let's go. It was in the days when the judges ruled in Israel, before there was a king. The children of Israel had become lax in their observance of the Torah and had called God's punishment down upon themselves. A great famine reigned in the land of Israel. There was a certain man in Judah named Elimelech. He was a wealthy merchant who was not used to hunger and poverty, And so he thought he could escape from the misery by moving elsewhere. He therefore took his wife, Naomi, and their 2 sons and went to live in Moab. So again, they're living in Beit Lechem, in the place of Judah, in the tribe of Judah. And this guy's name is Elimelech. He has a wife, Naomi. He takes his wife and his 2 sons to move out of town because of the famine. Ruth became friendly with this Jewish family. Okay, I'm going to give you the summary. We're going to drop this guy's summary. What happens in short is as follows. So we read about the famine. So they move. 2 of their sons, Abimelech and Naomi's sons, Machlon and Kilion, 2 of those sons marry Moabite girls. One is Ruth, and one is Orpah. The sons, over time, the husband dies, Abimelech dies, the 2 sons die. So now you have Naomi, the Jewish mother-in-law, and Ruth and Orpah, the 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. Naomi hears that God answered the Jewish people. In other words, the famine has passed, and now there's grain in Israel. She wants to go home. Her daughters-in-law start the journey back. She discourages them, and there's this very powerful scene where her one daughter-in-law, she kisses her, she sends her off on the way. Orpah leaves Naomi. Ruth does not leave. She cleaves to her, and she says, wherever you go, I go. Where you lie, I will lie. Where your nation is my nation, your God is my God. Very powerful scene. She stays. They come back to Israel. Okay, Israel, they're both poor at this point. So Naomi, the mother-in-law, sends the daughter-in-law to go glean and collect the gifts of produce to the poor. And chance happens, she ends up in the field of a relative named Boaz. And Boaz comes to the field, and Boaz sees this girl, asks, who is this? They tell her she's Naomi's Moabite daughter-in-law. And basically he says, okay, treat her nicely, make sure she has food. Okay. Ruth goes home, tells Naomi what happened. Naomi comes up with this plan. She sends, it's the harvest, it's good weather, so Boaz is going to sleep outside in the field. She sends Ruth to the field at night with to Boaz. She says, when he's sleeping, you come up to him and you ask him to marry you, because it's the levirate marriage. In the biblical times, there was a commandment that if somebody dies without children, the relative has to marry the widow, so the child who will be born will carry the name of the deceased father. So that's the scene where he wakes up and she's at his feet and he gets frightened. Who are you? I'm Ruth. I want you to marry me. He says, well, there's a legal issue. There's a closer relative. So in the morning, they go to the market and they find the relative and they say, do you want to redeem the field of our relative? Because part of that process of the relative's responsibility to other relatives is to redeem the field. If it was sold, to redeem the field so the field remains in the family. And he says, yes, I want to redeem the field. He says, if you redeem the field, you also have to marry Ruth, because she is also needs to be, quote unquote, redeemed. So the relative says, I'm not doing that. I don't want to destroy my heritage, meaning to say it was not appropriate to marry a convert. We'll talk about why in a moment. And therefore they make the deal. He signs off. He gives Boaz the responsibility of the redeemer. Boaz marries Ruth. They have a child, and the end of the book gives you the lineage from Ruth and Boaz till the King David. That's the story of the Book of Ruth. There's a little bit more drama there, but that's essentially the story. We'll open up and read some of the verses inside and see what the broader themes are. If I said it wrong, if anyone wants to add details, please do. Comments or questions, welcome. Please, jump in. But we want to really think about what is really happening here. What's the point of the story? What are the themes of the story? What is the story trying to tell us? So in other words, what's the backstory? And here we get to a very interesting point that's related to the question of King David's lineage. and the question of why this gentleman, who is Boaz, who is the closer relative, was willing to redeem the field of his deceased relative, but he wasn't willing to marry Ruth. And he says the words, I'm afraid to do it because I may destroy my nachala, I may destroy my heritage. And this is the real backstory. The real backstory is that Ruth was a Moabite woman, a Moabite convert. The problem for Ruth, and therefore for King David, and therefore anyone who will marry her and her descendants and her lineage, the problem is that there's a verse in the Torah that says that an Ammonite and a Moabite cannot marry a Jew. In other words, you cannot marry even a convert from Ammon and Moab, you cannot marry them. And the reason for that is because they were sort of our cousins. Ammon and Moab, in the book of Genesis, they're the daughters of Lot. After the cities of Sodom and Amorah were destroyed, so the daughters of Lot think the whole world was destroyed. So they have relations with their father. They get them drunk. They have relations. They each have a child. Older one is Moab. Second one is Ammon. They become two nations that are our relatives. Now they're living east. They are living east of the Jordan River. And when the Jewish people want to come into Israel, in the book of Deuteronomy, they do not let us pass through their land. So instead of treating us like relatives, they don't let us pass through our land. So we get very offended. The Torah is very offended. And the Torah says that we're not allowed to marry an Ammonite and a Moabite. Why? The Torah says because they did not greet you with bread and water on your way out of Egypt. Not just they didn't greet us, they didn't let us go through, they didn't let us pass. Even when we came to them, they wouldn't let us pass. So this is the problem. So you're not allowed to marry them. So whoever's going to marry them is going to have a trouble whether or not their children are legitimate Jewish people. And King David had the same problem. Forget about people came to him and they said, and when he became the king, the Jewish people are like, could you be a king if your great grandmother is Ruth, you come to the Moabites? And other people said, forget about a king. The question is, are you even Jewish? Because we have this great problem of a Moabite convert cannot become part of the Jewish people. So when the Medrash says, and I mentioned it earlier, that the reason why we read this book, that the purpose that the book was written, forget about why we read it, the purpose of the book was written is to give us the yichus, to give us the lineage of King David. So you can read it technically. We have to know who King David's great-grandmother was. But it could be it's much deeper. It could be what it's telling us. This book is going to tell us why King David is a kosher Jew and therefore a kosher king, and therefore the monarchy is a proper monarchy. In other words, this book is telling us why Ruth is allowed to marry the Jewish people, despite the fact that her mother, that she's a Moabite convert. So it's really telling a story, but it certainly has political ramifications, because, like I said, it's not just telling us technically who David's grandmother is, but it's telling a story about David's grandmother but there's a lot of baggage there because she's a Moabite convert. And the question is, and maybe these 4 chapters are addressing this issue specifically, even though it's not addressing it explicitly. So that is a little bit of background, and we'll talk about how that happens. So Roberta wants to know, because they didn't greet us. That's what the verse says. Now, if your neighbor doesn't greet you, there's no problem. But if your cousin doesn't greet you, if your brother's not there for you, that's offensive. Right? Somehow, if it's a stranger, there were other nations that didn't greet us. So what? We have no expectations. But if your brother or your cousin, your relative doesn't greet you with bread and water, in other words, does not help you get your basic necessities when you're in need, then that's a problem, and that represents that there's a flaw in the character. I'm not going to say the character of the nation, but there's a flaw in the culture. This is not a culture that expresses kindness, and therefore we don't want to bring those elements into the Jewish people. Okay, so now we know what we have to deal with. We're up against a lot. To say that King David is a kosher Jew, to say King David is a kosher king, to say King Solomon who built the temple, they're Jewish and they're kosher, we have a hurdle. The hurdle is we're going against seemingly going against an explicit verse. So we have to write a book That will explain it. But we're not explaining it explicitly, it's being explained implicitly. Okay? So there's a technicality, there's a technical answer that the Talmud quotes, that there was a tradition, but remember, this is before the oral Torah was written, before the Mishnah. This is almost 800 years before the Mishnah. So there's no written, the oral Torah is not written. The commentary is not written, so it's not very well known. And therefore, Boaz may know this, but other people don't know this. What does the verse say? What is the rabbinic tradition? Rabbinic tradition is, it's an unusual tradition. In other words, it's not the common way of reading the Bible, but that's the tradition. What the tradition is, when the verse says that an Ammonite and a Moabite cannot marry a Jew, that an Ammonite and a Moabite should not join the congregation of God, it's written in the singular, in the masculine. So the verse says, so the rabbinic tradition says that it means masculine, not feminine. It means Moavi, a Moabite male cannot join the Jewish people, but a Moabite female may. That's the tradition, which is very strange because in biblical Hebrew, when you speak in the masculine, that's neutral. If you want to mean everybody, you speak in the masculine. But here we say no, it's masculine, it's not feminine. It's Moavi, not Moaviyah. If you're a Moabite woman, no problem, you can join the people. So as soon as that's recorded in the Talmud says, what do you mean? What are you talking about? Next verse, it says that the Egyptian convert should not join the Jewish people for 3 generations. So you're going to say it's just Egyptian male, not female? It's ridiculous. Everything in the Torah is written in the male. So the Talmud therefore says, no, you got to understand. In this case, it makes sense that it means specifically Moabites and not specifically Moabites and not specifically male, not female. Why? Says the Talmud that not always does the Torah give us the reason of why a Moabite cannot join the Jewish people. But in this case, the Torah does. The Torah says, because they did not greet you with bread and water. So the Talmud says, who makes that decision? Who's the policy maker? Who decides whether or not we're going to let people come into the land of Moab and give them water and bread? Who has the right to vote? Well, the women don't make those decisions. So therefore, the decision doesn't reflect negatively on the women because they have no right to vote. So therefore, in this context, it makes sense that when it says Moabite and Ammonite, and it says the reason, and the reason is applicable to the males, not to the females, so then the verse applies to the males, not to the females. That's the Talmud, that's the Talmudic tradition, that's the tradition, and that's why we believe the King David's kosher. Not everybody believed it. In his days, the people disagreed with him. People called him an illegitimate Jew. Okay. But let's assume for a moment that this is the case. Let's assume for a moment that we assume that this is the case. If that's the case, what do we need to do about King David? What do we need to do to tell us that King David is a legitimate Jew? What you're going to have to show is that that the females of Moab, specifically Ruth, specifically this individual, is the epitome of kindness. Because again, the reason why the Moabite would be excluded would be because of the fact that they did not greet the Jewish people, their brothers, with bread and water. But we're saying that applies to the men, not to the women. So here we have a woman who not only is not cruel, but goes out of her way at the expense of her own well-being, sacrifices her own well-being for kindness for somebody else. That's the grandmother you want. That's the person that you want. You want her because she's a good grandmother, okay? But you want her to say this is the archetype of a Moabite woman who is kind, and therefore the biblical verse does not apply to her. Doesn't apply to the whole gender, to the female gender. But you see why, and you see this expressed in the story of Ruth. So to summarize, what we're saying here, this is a book about the power of not just conversion, the power of kindness of this individual, of Ruth, how the power of kindness puts her and gives her the merit to become the mother, the matriarch of the monarchy of the Jewish people. Eventually, her descendants is King David, King Solomon. Eventually, the Mashiach will be a descendant of Ruth. Okay, so she has a very powerful space in Jewish history. She's a convert. Not only is she a convert, she's a Moabite convert, which was a very big issue at the time, a very big hurdle to overcome. And yet, so therefore, we have this story to explain and demonstrate the Talmudic idea that the prohibition does not apply to females because the females were kind. And you want proof? Look at her life story, you'll see. So now all we have to do is go through the book and find the places of extraordinary kindness that she displays. Okay, so that is a little bit of the politics behind the book. And again, so therefore now the overarching theme is about, if that reading is correct, the overarching theme is the kindness of Ruth, and that elicits the kindness of Boaz, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now we know at least that's sort of one way to look at the entire story. So that's point number one. Point number two about when you read this book. When you read this book, like all good stories, there is always the character, and then sort of contrasting that with another character. And usually in literature, what you do is, not usually, but often in the Torah, you have this guy's a good guy, this guy's a bad guy. And that's the contrast. But it's very interesting that within this story, as we will demonstrate, within this story, we're always contrasting we're always contrasting the person, the righteous person in the story, not against somebody who is negative, but against somebody who is neutral. In other words, it's not a question of being kind or being cruel. In this book, it's about following the law, doing what makes sense, doing what's common, versus going beyond yourself and sacrificing of yourself for somebody else. And throughout almost every fork in the road in this book, where different people take different courses of action, and the book draws attention to that divergence. Again, it's not a question of a good choice versus a bad choice. It's a question of a good choice. It's a question of doing what makes sense, what is rational, what is normal, what is not considered cruel by any stretch of the imagination, versus going beyond the letter of the law and expressing kindness. And that's what we want to say is this history of King David. And maybe we're going to say, maybe that's the story we tell ourselves. Think about this for a second. That's the story we tell ourselves about a monarchy. What is the monarchy? And think about what other cultures say about their monarchs. What's the power? Why is this guy in power? What's his lineage? So in other cultures, you're going to talk about the wars. You're going to talk about how powerful they are, right? That's what's attractive to people. The might, the strength. What is the story we're saying? What's King David's story? Where does he come from? What's the story the monarchy tells about itself? This is a very interesting point, right? What stories do you tell about yourself if you're a monarch? And here, the stories that we're telling about ourselves, the story the monarchy is telling about ourselves, in other words, in the Bible, we have the Book of Ruth, which really doesn't belong in the Bible. What's it doing in the Bible? Okay, it's a nice story. There are many nice stories, right? Oh, but this is important. Why is this important? Because it's telling you about the lineage of King David. And that's, of course, a very important part of our history, though. All the stories of the prophets is the Jewish kings, the kings of Judea, kings of Israel. In other words, you have the monarchy is a very important part of our history. So we tell the story of our history in the scroll of Ruth. Okay, but what are we telling? Are the conquests of King David? He was a very great warrior. That's not the stories we tell. We don't say how mighty they were, how powerful they were. What do we say? They were kind people. Okay, that's how you get people to look up to you in this culture, and that's a beautiful thing. Okay. I think it's time to start looking at some of the specifics of the story. But if anybody has any comments or questions, if you like these ideas or you don't like these ideas, please share. I would love to hear. Otherwise, we start looking at the specifics of the story. Yeah. So once again, just to repeat what somebody asked, the connection between the book of Ruth and Shavuot. So the first thing is that it's about the lineage of King David, and King David is related to Shavuot because King David, according to the tradition, was both born and passed away on Shavuot. Another interpretation is because Shavuot is we celebrate one of the biblical holidays. It's one of the reasons for the biblical holiday is the season of the harvest. So we celebrate the harvest. So we want to read the book of Ruth, which many of its scenes play out in the stories of keeping the mitzvot of the harvest, which is leaving the grain, leaving the stalks of grain to the poor. So we want to remind people about that those commandments. And then you have the third reason would be that in some sense on Shavuot we all convert, we all accept Judaism, and Ruth is an example of somebody who accepts Judaism and accepts the Torah and converts. So she's the inspiration for all of us on Shavuot when we sort of rededicate ourselves to accepting the precepts of the Torah and of Judaism. Okay. Now it came to pass in the day. So we're starting Ruth chapter 1. It has 4 chapters. We're not going to read everything inside. We'll see what we want to focus on. Okay. So now it came to pass in the days when the judges judged that there was a famine in the land, and a man went from Bethlehem of Judea to sojourn in the fields of Moab, he and his wife and his sons. Okay, so he checked out of town. He went to Moab. Now, is this good or bad? Did he do any sin? Did he commit any sin? So the simple story is no. He didn't commit any sin, because again, we're trying to show that and it's not a question of kindness versus evil. It's kindness versus just doing the normal thing. Now, it's certainly not a sin to leave Moab, to leave Israel in the famine. We look at the Bible. Abraham also leaves the land of Israel when there's a famine. So he leaves. Nothing wrong with that. The Medrash is much more critical. The Medrash says he was a wealthy person, and the reason why he leaves is because he doesn't want to share the wealth with the poor. If you're wealthy and everyone else around you is poor, everyone's going to come asking you for money. You can't do it. He picks up and he leaves. That's the rabbinic tradition. Why do the rabbis come up with that perspective? Like what in the verse tells you indicates that it was something negative. So one theory is, where do you go in that region? Where do you go when there's a famine? So there's no rain. So there's a famine. So where do you go? Well, throughout the Bible, you always go to Egypt, because Egypt is you have the Nile, and therefore the Nile Delta is fertile, and there's water, and there's always food there. There's no famine. The one famine that happened, Joseph predicted the famine and became and rose to fame because he was able to say something that nobody would believe, that there could be a famine in Egypt. So if there's a famine, you go to Egypt. There's a famine, and he goes to, if I ask you, if you didn't know the verse, and I say, oh, there was a famine in Israel, and therefore Avimelech went to, you would say Egypt, 100%. But instead he goes to Moab. What's Moab? If there's a famine in Israel, there's no rain in Moab either. Moab, the culture of kindness doesn't exist. So no one's coming to ask you for money. No one's coming to ask you for kindness. You go to that culture, you're protected. In Bethlehem, everyone's going to come and ask you for bread, and that's why he checks out. So that's the sort of more negative way of reading that verse. Now, the reason why they say it, because he died. And now Avimelech died. And now Avimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And they married Moabite women, one named Arpa and one other named Ruth. And they dwelt there for about 10 years. Both Machlon and Kilion also died, and the woman was left bereft of her 2 children and her husband. So she's alone. All she has is her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. Now she arose with her daughters-in-law and returned from the fields of Moab, for she had heard in the field of Moab that the Lord had remembered his people to give them bread. Then she went forth from that place where she had been, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the road to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go return each woman to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the deceased and with me. May the Lord grant you, and you find rest, each woman in her husband's house. And she kissed them, and they raised their voices and wept. In other words, what she's saying, what are you coming to Israel with me? First of all, you don't have a husband. Second of all, probably the conversion is a problem for these women. And go home, go to your father's home, find a wonderful husband, find another husband, live happily ever after. And that's what the mother-in-law insists. And they all cry. And 10, and they said to her, no, but we will return with you to your people. So Naomi insists that they shouldn't. Verse 11, now Naomi said, return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they should be your husbands? What are you waiting for? You have no future here. Return, my daughters, go, for I have become too old to marry, that I should say that I have hope. Even if I had a husband tonight, and even if I had born sons. In other words, it's a levirate marriage. So theoretically, if Naomi would have another son, he would marry the widows of his deceased brothers. But she says, even if I marry tonight and I have a son, it will take you years until you can marry him. It's not a good idea. Stay home. 13, would you wait for them until they grow up? Would you shut yourselves off for them and not marry? No, my daughters, for it is much more bitter for me than for you. For the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. In other words, here, I'm in a bad situation. You don't have a future with me. Go home. And they raised their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth cleaved to her. And this is the scene. And she said, lo, your sister-in-law has returned to her people. So Orpah goes home. So Naomi now tells Ruth, your sister-in-law went, no problem. To return, I'm sorry. And she said, lo, your sister, verse 15. And she said, lo, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and to her God. Return after your sister-in-law. So I guess there's a discussion when they marry, do they convert? Even if they converted, here she says, go back to your God. 16. And Ruth said, do not entreat me to leave you, to return from following you. For wherever, and this is a very famous verse, for wherever you will go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. When you die, I will die. And where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. So may the Lord do to me, and so may he continue, if anything but death, separate me and you. So she is basically saying, I'm committed to this. Verse 18, and she saw, and she was determined to go with her. So she stopped speaking to her. In other words, she stopped telling her to stop coming. And what happens? They come to Beit Lechem, and they both went on until they arrived at Beit Lechem. And it came to pass when they arrived at Beit Lechem that the entire city was astir on their account. And they said, is this Naomi? She left, she was a prominent woman with a family, with wealth, and now she comes back. She's alone and she's penniless. And then here's a play. The word Naomi comes from the word Noam, is sweetness. They said, this is Naomi? She says, don't call me Naomi. Don't call me sweet because the Lord made me bitter. So verse 20, and she said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Mara means bitter. For the Almighty has dealt with me very bitterly with me. I went full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why then should you call me Naomi, seeing that the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has dealt harshly with me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth, the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the fields of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So the barley harvest is earlier than the wheat harvest, so this is like a little before Passover. We're about Passover. So that's the story. So again, what have we seen here? We got the story, but the way the Torah is setting this up, as we mentioned earlier, you're contrasting Ruth and Orpah. And if I ask you, did Orpah do anything wrong? Of course not. But Ruth is going beyond the letter. She's staying with her mother-in-law because she doesn't want to leave her alone. We're going to see later that act is defined as kindness, where Boaz says, I heard about the kindness that you did to your mother-in-law. Now, this is a kindness that's not required by the law, and it's basically at the expense of her own future. So nobody would say you have to do it or even that you should do it. But that's the person she was, and that's the act she did. Okay. Now we'll go to chapter 2. And chapter 2 is she goes out to collect the gifts, the stalks of barley, and she meets another important character, which would be Boaz, who's the relative of her deceased father-in-law, and they meet up and they have the talk and they have the conversation, and then we'll see what's happening here behind the scenes as well. So we are at chapter 2. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a mighty man of valor, meaning a prominent person, of the family of Abimelech, and his name was Boaz. So she have a wealthy relative. Why doesn't Naomi go and speak to him or ask him for help? So it's not clear. Maybe she's ashamed. Maybe she's embarrassed. Maybe she doesn't think he's going to help her. We don't know, but that's the story. So we have a man of valor. We have a prominent person, family of Abimelech. His name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, I will go now to the field and I will glean among the ears of grain after someone whom I will please. And she said, go, my daughter. In other words, the law is that when the people harvesting are going to harvest, the gleans, the stalks fall down, and then the poor people can come and collect. But the reality was that the person harvesting may chase away this poor person if he doesn't like them. You're going to see that according to the tradition, that's what happened in other fields. So she says, hopefully somebody will let me collect the grain. So verse 3, and she went and she came and she gleaned in the field after the reapers. The rabbis say, what does it mean? She went and she came and she gathered. Just say she went and she gathered. She went and she came. That implies that she tried other fields, and other fields people didn't let her because she was an outsider. She was a Moabite woman. She wasn't a Jewish girl. In any case, the verse continues, and her chance was, and it happened, and her chance was, in other words, Vayikar Mikra, a chance happened. Of course, we don't believe in chance, but that's what Mikra, by chance. In other words, it wasn't premeditated. She came to the field that belonged to Boaz, who was in the family of Avimelech. And now we're going to introduce Boaz. And behold, Boaz came from Beit Lechem, and he said to the reapers, may the Lord be with you. And they said to him, the Lord bless you. And Boaz said to the servant, who stood over the reapers, to whom does this maiden belong? What's the answer? If you're going to ask, there's a person in charge of the work, and you're Boaz, and you ask a simple question, who is this girl? And he knows who she is. What's the answer? She's Naomi's daughter-in-law, right? No, that's not the answer. That's not the way people perceived her. You'll see how she is, how this person in charge of the reapers, how he describes her. So look at verse 6. And the servant in charge of the reapers answered and said, she is a Moabite maiden who returned with Naomi from the fields of Moab. Okay, this is very interesting, right? That's not the way you describe her. Say she's Naomi's daughter-in-law. No, he defines her as an outsider. He defines her as a Moabite maiden. In other words, she doesn't really belong here. And then, and she says he wanted to glean. So Boaz tells Ruth, and Boaz said to Ruth, have you not heard, my daughter? Do not go to glean in other fields, neither shall you go away from here, and here you shall stay with my maidens. And basically he says you could stay here. And verse 10, and she fell on her face and prostrated herself to the ground. Then she said to him, why have I pleased you that you should take cognizance of me, seeing that I am a foreigner? So in other words, obviously she's surprised at his treating her this way, even though she's a foreigner. So what does he answer? And Boaz replied and said to her, it has been told to me all that you did to your mother-in-law after your husband's death. And you left your father and your mother and your native land, and you went to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward your deeds, and may your reward be full from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take shelter. And the story continues, but the bottom line is, she comes home, and mother-in-law says, where have you been? And she says, I met Boaz. And she says like this. She says, oh, okay, this is a great idea. Go back, go. He's our relative. That's what he says, number 20. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be he of the Lord, who did not leave off his kindness with the living or with the deceased. And Naomi said to her, the man is our kinsman. He is one of our near kinsmen. Migoy aleinu. The Hebrew word is goel, a redeemer. He's our redeemer. He's our relative. He has to marry you or release you. And that's the end of chapter 2. So chapter 1, I think, concludes with really two problems. They come back and they're in poverty, and they also don't have a future. Well, now we solved the second problem, the poverty issue, because she's going to go back to the fields of Boaz, but we still have the problem of the future. In other words, who is she going to marry? And that problem we'll have to deal with in chapter 3. There's a whole sort of semi-story, a side story that's very interesting that the rabbis mentioned in the Mishnah, the first tractate of Brachot. We have talked about this in the past, and that is that this verse, which seems like a very simple verse. And behold, Boaz came from the Beit Lechem, and he said to the reapers, "May the Lord be with you." And they said to him, "The Lord bless you." The rabbis say that this was a big deal. The idea that when you bless another person, to mention God's name. In other words, up to that point in the Bible, you don't find a verse where somebody says, "How are you doing?" And the guy says, "Thank God." It's like, you don't greet somebody with mentioning God's name. You want to mention God's name, you talk to God. If you want to talk to God, you mention God's name, but you don't bring God's name into mundane matters, into mundane discussions between people. And Boaz was the first one to do so. And that is actually in the Mishnah, it's mentioned amongst the things that people almost did against the Torah, but they did it for a good cause. One of the it talks about the notion of writing the oral Torah. Writing the oral Torah was against the law, but at that point it was the right thing to do, so they did it. And amongst the examples doesn't say so explicitly, but from the context it's understood. That's what the Mishnah is trying to say, is that Boaz comes to Beit Lechem and he wants to speak to the reapers, says, "How are you doing?" He blesses them with God's name. They bless him. So the question is, why was Boaz the first one to do this? What about Boaz's perspective on life gets him to be the first one to, when he greets another person, to greet them by mentioning Hashem? So there are all kinds of theories, but one theory is Boaz is highlighting to the people that the way you treat somebody else is part of your relationship with God. In other words, it's not that we have a way to treat people and then we have a relationship with God and a relationship with people. The person is created in the image of God. And therefore, the way you interact with other people, you have to bring the holiness and the godliness into that transaction, into that relationship as well. And therefore, perhaps you can connect these two stories. In other words, nobody else asks, "Who is this girl?" He does. He asks. In other words, he's concerned for the people around him. He also happens to be the guy that institutes that when you see somebody, he shows the model. When you see somebody else, you bless them. Don't just greet them, but bless them with the name of Hashem. In other words, he is seeing the spark of God in every person, and that leads him to his empathy, or at least even his concern or noticing other people. Nobody else asks who this person is. And it's interesting, everyone knew who she is, because even the lad says, "Oh, she's the daughter-in-law of Naomi coming back from Beit Lechem," but nobody reaches out to her, right? She's a foreigner. Nobody reaches out to her. No one shows any gesture of kindness toward her. But here, Elimelech does. Elimelech is the guy, but Elimelech is the person who what? Elimelech is the person who understands that when you interact with somebody else, you mention God's name, because that relationship is not separate from your relationship with Hashem, because every person is created in the image of Hashem. So that's a little bit about chapter 2. And then we go to chapter 3, which is we have to create this plan, where Naomi creates the plan where we solve the problem of the immediate short-term problem of the hunger, of the poverty. But what about the future plan, the future issue, which would be the issue of the marriage. Okay. So go ahead, Vicky, please.
Oh, thank you. But I don't know if I have to save it to the end, but I had a question about sincerity of conversion, comparing why we study Book of Ruth and Shavuot and comparing sincerity of Ruth's conversion to our conversion. I think there is a matter that our conversion wasn't, as a people, wasn't as sincere. We were kind of forced. So was that the kind of the issue that Ruth's conversion was even more sincere in that regard? Because she didn't have a husband, she didn't have a child, so that was purely her soul yearning
Right.
to connect to people.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting discussion of whether or not the Jewish people accepted the Torah out of free will or because they had no options, right? And it's the Talmud in the tractate Megillah, where it talks about the story of Esther, actually makes this point and says that people can always say, and in some sense it's true, that the Jewish people did not, when they accepted the Torah, they accepted it by force, because there's rabbinic tradition that God told the Jewish people, either you accept the Torah or I'll bury you here under this mountain. Now, you can read that literally, God would force them, or you can read it figuratively. In other words, they were overwhelmed with God doing everything for them, taking them out of Egypt. So what are you going to say? You're going to say, I'm not going to accept the Torah, right? So they were overwhelmed by the love he showed them. But the bottom line is, the Talmud itself says that, yeah, you can say that the Jewish people did not accept it of their own free will until the story of Purim. Story of Purim, almost 1,000 years after the Torah was given, was the Jewish people remain loyal to Judaism despite the threat of genocide. And that's when their commitment to the Torah is solidified. That's when you see, probably retroactively, but in other words, that's the point where you see that the acceptance of the Torah was sincere. And in some sense, what you're saying is that with Ruth and with any other sincere convert, in some sense, their commitment to Judaism is more powerful than the person who is Jewish by birth, or even the Jewish people accepting it at Sinai. They're doing it with a family, they're not alone, etc. And maybe that's the message, that when we accept the Torah, we have to have that level of commitment that Ruth displays.
Thank you, Rabbi. But the Purim was after Ruth, right?
After the story, way after, yes, way after. The story of Purim is I would say 500-600 years later. Yeah, more 600-700 years later. Yeah. But I'm saying collectively, we're not talking about an individual person. The Purim story is an era of history. In other words, the era of history where to be a Jew was actually dangerous, right? So you need that scenario to play out to see, and when that scenario plays out and the Jewish people are loyal, say, oh, now they accepted the Torah. Sinai, okay, fine, they accepted it. But there they had little choice because of the circumstances. Right, even though technically they had choice, but because of the circumstances, they didn't really have much choice. And like you were saying, it wasn't against their own personal interests until the story of Purim.
Thank you.
Okay. So we don't have much time left for the next two chapters, but we'll read it. The drama is nice. Naomi, her mother-in-law. Whoops. I can't see what's going on over here. Naomi, her mother-in-law said to her, my daughter, shall I not seek rest for you, that it be good for you? In other words, we got to settle down. And now, is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maidens you were? Behold, he is winnowing the threshing floor at the barley tonight. In other words, once he finishes once the harvest is over, he goes back home, harder to get to him. Now he's doing the work of the winnowing of the grain. He's going to be in the field. Go to him at night. And you shall bathe and anoint yourself and put on your clothes and go down to the threshing floor. Do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. And it shall be, when he lies down, that you shall know where he will lie, and you shall come and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she said, all that you say to me, I will do. That's what she does. Boaz ate and drank, and his heart was merry, and he went to lie at the edge of the stack. And she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And it came to pass at midnight, and the man quaked and was taken around. And behold, the woman was lying at his feet. And he said, Who are you? And she said, I am Ruth, your handmaid. And you shall spread your skirt over your handmaid, for you are a near kinsman. In other words, spreading out the garment is a euphemism for marriage. And he said, May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. Your latest act of kindness is greater than the first, not to follow the young men, whether poor or rich. In other words, he's saying now the kindness that you did now is greater than the kindness that you did to your mother-in-law by coming here. So he's defining it as kindness. Why? He's an old man who wants to marry an old man. So verse 11, and now, my daughter, do not fear. All that you say I will do for you, for the entire gate of my people know that you are a valiant woman, valiant, Eshet Chayil, you're a woman of valor. But he says, I have a problem. Not I have a problem. There is a closer redeemer. And now, indeed, I am a near kinsman, but there is a kinsman closer than I. So he says, stay overnight tonight, and I will come to pass in the morning that I will redeem you. Well, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, I will redeem you. As the Lord lives, that's a promise. Lie down until morning. In other words, he says, I'm not just pushing you away. I'm making a promise that either that guy will marry you or I will. Okay. And she lay at his feet until morning, and she rose before one could recognize his fellow, for he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, ready the shawl you are wearing and hold it. And she held it, and he measured out 6 barleys and placed them upon her, and he came to the city. Comes back to her mother-in-law. She says, what's the story? And she said, he gave me these 6 barleys, for he said to me, do not come empty-handed for your mother-in-law. And she said, sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will fall, for the man will not rest until he resolves the matter today. Okay, so Naomi, even though the relationship between Naomi and Boaz is interesting because he didn't reach out to her to help, but she has confidence that he's going to solve this problem. And chapter 4 is the problem, is the story. So Boaz went up to the gate. The gate is the center of town, and sat down there. And behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz had spoken was passing. And he said, turn aside, sit down here, so and so. And he turned aside and sat down. The Torah does not mention his name. It's probably a form of rebuke. He doesn't want to marry Ruth. He doesn't want to redeem her. He doesn't get her name. It's almost like measure for measure. The reason why you would marry the Levirate marriage, the reason why you would marry the widow of a deceased relative is so that the name of the deceased relative should carry on. This guy doesn't want, that's what the verse says in Deuteronomy, to keep the name of his brother alive. This person doesn't want to keep the name of his brother alive, so he doesn't get a name. He's not named. So they start talking. He starts talking about a business transaction. Elimelech had a field. Naomi sold it. We have to buy it back. I want to buy it back. That guy says like this. It's a very interesting conversation. He says, yeah, I'm going to redeem the field. Then Boaz says, oh yeah, when you take the field, you also have to marry the daughter-in-law. He says, no, I'm not doing that. Verse 4. And he said, I will let you know, saying, buy it. Okay. And he said, meaning Boaz says to the near kinsman, Naomi, who has returned from the field of Moab, is selling the portion of the field that belonged to our brother Elimelech. And I said, I will let you know, saying, buy it in the presence of those who sit here and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem. And if he will not redeem, tell me, and I will know, for there is no one besides you to redeem, and I am after you. And he said, I will redeem. I'll buy the field back. And Boaz said, on the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi and from Ruth, the Moabitess, the wife of the deceased, you have bought it to preserve the name of the deceased and his heritage. In other words, you're buying it on behalf of Naomi, you're buying it on behalf of Ruth, and you have to maintain the name of the deceased. And that's euphemism for you have to marry her. The guy says, I'm not doing this. And the near kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I mar my heritage. Lest I destroy my heritage. Doesn't explain how that will destroy his heritage. But we know the background. We know that you marry a Moabite woman, people are going to say it's illegitimate marriage. The children may be considered illegitimate. Even David, generations later, was by some people could consider David illegitimate. And then we continue some about how they'd had the transaction with the shoe. We're getting to that right now. Witnesses, everything is fine. At the wedding, they give her a blessing. What's the blessing? And all the people who are in the gate and the elders replied, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is entering your house like Rachel and like Leah, both of whom build up the house of Israel, and prosper in Ephrata and be famous in Bethlehem. So this is very beautiful. And may your house be like the house of Peretz, whom Tamar bore to Judah, with the seed that the Lord will give you from this maiden. So there's so much to talk about in these two verses. First of all, Rachel and Leah, we know that Rachel also sacrifices of her well-being to allow Leah to enter the home. Okay. So just talking about the kindness, they evoke that level of kindness. And the other story they revoke is they say, your house should be like the house of Peretz, who was the great-grandfather who gave birth to Tamar and Judah. And let's not talk about Tamar and Judah because there's another whole story there, right? Tamar and Judah also is an illegitimate marriage. In other words, the entire tribe, they're members of the tribe of Judah. The entire tribe of Judah comes about through the relationship, the union between Tamar and Judah. I'm not going to say the entire, but this family, the family of Peretz, comes from the union between Judah and Tamar, who he thought was a harlot. So it's not the most modest union. So bringing that up again emphasizing that just like this marriage, some people could criticize it, but at the end of the day, it's holy and it's sincere. And they bless her, everything is fine. And at the end, you have the lineage going from verse 18. These are the generations of Peretz. Peretz begot Hetzron. Peretz is the son of Judah and Tamar. So Hetzron begot Ram. Ram begot Aminadav. Aminadav begot Nachshon. Nachshon begot Salmon. Salmon gave birth to Boaz. And Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. So Boaz, and therefore Ruth, how many generations? Son, grandson, great-grandson, great-great-grandson. That's the conclusion of the story of Ruth. A lot more to say. But again, what you see here is, could you criticize that guy, the so-and-so who doesn't want to marry Ruth? No, I don't want to do it. Boaz is going beyond the extra step. And that's really what the story is. And if you think about this book, compare it to the other books, the other Megillot, the scrolls. There's not that much drama. Scroll of Esther, there's warfare, there's drama, there's transformation. There's no great dramas in this book. But what advances the story is acts of human kindness. And maybe that's the purpose of the book. The purpose of the book is to say that the Jewish people, certainly the monarchy, the leadership of the Jewish people, is not built with great wars, even though we have those as well, but it's founded on acts of human kindness, and that's how we build the Jewish people. So this is a little bit, like I said, this is just just touching upon some of the points, and I hope this was enjoyable. Everybody should have a wonderful day and a happy Shavuot. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. That the idea that you highlighted at the end was absolutely beautiful, because also points out that it's not only Jewish trait by nature, right? That the country can exhibit it as well. But I have a more like a technical question. That Chalitza ceremony, was it first described here? Because it's not Talmudic then. It's biblical.
Chalitza ceremony is biblical. The transaction that he basically gave the other person, the relative, the so and so, gave Boaz permission to redeem the field and to marry Ruth. You need a transaction to give it power, and that's what he did. He took off his shoe, and that's why in one of the forms of transaction that we have in the Talmud, even for monetary transactions, would be handing a piece that the seller gives the buyer a garment, and the buyer lifts the seller's garment. So
it's not Talmud. It's not Talmudic then. It's biblical, right? Because
correct.
It was first mentioned here, or
again, there's 2 points. The levirate marriage is mentioned even before. It's mentioned in the book of Deuteronomy.
Right. But the ceremony itself, mentioned here the first time.
The ceremony itself is expressed here. That's where it's written. I don't know if it's the first time, but this is certainly a prominent time. I was referring to more the verse. Let me share the screen. Try to share the screen. Verse 6. So in verse 6, the gentleman says, the so-and-so says, the near kinsman says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I mar my heritage. So in verse 7, now this was the custom in former times in Israel. Former times doesn't mean it was only in former times. It means from former times, meaning a very ancient custom in Israel concerning redemption and exchange. To confirm anything, one will remove his shoe and give it to his fellow. And this was the attestation in Israel. In other words, if you want to make a formal act of acquisition, one of the ways was the shoe came off and people transferred it. Think about a shoe. Today you take another garment, but the garments they wore then, you couldn't just take off. It was a robe. They wore a robe and that's it. So what are you going to take off the robe? That's not going to work. So you take off a shoe. Even in Talmudic times, in the Talmud, it comes down to Jewish law. That's one very common form of transaction. Making a transaction, making a kinyan, making an formal act of acquisition. It's called chalifin, where you transfer with a kinyan sudar. You transfer with a garment, and that also in the Talmud is derived from this story.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you very much.
Wonderful day, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.